Hello, and welcome back to Mr. Easy Peasy English. Today, we are traveling back to the 1700s to meet a man who became the very first president of the United States, George Washington. But this is not just about politics or history. This is the story of a boy growing up on a farm, a young man exploring wild forests, a soldier learning from failure, and a leader who carried the hopes of an entire nation. So sit back, relax, and let's walk through his life together. The year was 1732, in a land still ruled by Britain. The American colonies were young and rough. Farms stretched across green fields, and thick forests bordered rivers that seemed endless. In one small Virginia farmhouse, a baby was born. His name was George Washington. George's family worked hard. They grew tobacco and cared for the land. His father, Augustine, was strict, but taught his children discipline. His mother, Mary, was strong-willed and protective. When George was just 11 years old, his father died. Suddenly, the boy had to grow up quickly. There was no long education, no fancy schools. Instead, George read what books he could find. He copied long lists of rules about good behavior, like, "Speak not when others speak." He practiced handwriting over and over until the letters were neat and strong. He may not have had the finest education, but even as a boy, George wanted to live with honor. As a teenager, George looked out at the forests beyond his home and dreamed of adventure. When he was only 16, he became a surveyor, a person who measures land and makes maps. Picture him, a tall young man with long legs, carrying heavy tools, walking for miles through the wild countryside. He crossed rivers, climbed hills, and sometimes slept under the stars. The work was not easy. The forests were thick, the winters cold. But George loved it. He learned how to survive in the wilderness, how to find his way when there were no roads, and how valuable land was to the future of the colonies. It was during these years that George grew into a man who was calm, patient, and strong. In his early 20s, George put down his measuring tools and picked up a sword. The colonies were not peaceful anymore. Britain and France were fighting for power in North America. This was called the French and Indian War. George joined the British Army. At first, he was inexperienced. In one of his very first battles, he made mistakes and was forced to surrender. Imagine the shame he must have felt, standing before his enemies, realizing he had failed. But George did not give up. He returned to fight again. Over the years, he showed great courage. Bullets tore through his coat. 2 horses were shot from under him. But somehow, he survived. His men saw his bravery and began to trust him. The war taught him about leadership. It taught him that battles are not won only with weapons, but with patience, planning, and the strength to keep going when everything feels lost. After the war, George returned to Virginia. He was no longer just a soldier. He was also a man ready to build a life. He married Martha Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 young children. George treated them as his own, raising them with care. They lived at a large estate called Mount Vernon, overlooking the Potomac River. The house stood tall on a hill, with fields stretching down toward the water. George loved farming. He experimented with crops, managed workers, and walked his land with pride. Though respected by his neighbors, George preferred quiet evenings with Martha, sitting by the fire, away from the noise of politics. At least, that's what he hoped his life would be. But history had other plans. By the 1770s, tension was boiling in the colonies. The British Crown demanded more taxes. Colonists wanted freedom to make their own choices. The air was electric with anger and hope. In 1775, when war finally broke out, George Washington was chosen to lead the Continental Army. Now imagine this: George, tall and serious, riding his horse at the head of a ragged group of soldiers. They had little money, almost no uniforms, and often not enough food. But they had something powerful: a dream of liberty. The war was long and brutal. At Valley Forge, the winter cut deep. Soldiers wrapped rags around their bleeding feet because they had no shoes. Many were ready to give up. But Washington stood with them. He walked among his men, speaking calmly, sharing their suffering, reminding them what they were fighting for. Year after year, the Americans lost battles, then won small victories, then lost again. But George never quit. Slowly, with help from France, the tide turned. Finally, in 1781, at Yorktown, the British surrendered. The war was over. The colonies were free. George had led his people to independence. After the war, George only wanted to return to Mount Vernon. He dreamed of farming in peace. But the people had other ideas. They saw in him a leader who could guide the new nation. And so, in 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States. It was not an easy job. There were no examples to follow, no rules already written. Every decision he made set a path for the future. Would the president be like a king, or would he serve the people? George chose humility. He dressed simply. He shook hands instead of bowing. He listened carefully before making choices. And when he finished 2 terms, 8 years, he stepped down, even though many wanted him to stay. By doing this, he showed that America would be a nation of laws, not of kings. After leaving the presidency, George returned to Mount Vernon once more. There, he walked the fields, visited neighbors, and spent quiet evenings with Martha. But in 1799, only a few years after his retirement, he caught a sudden illness. Within days, he was gone. He was 67 years old. The nation grieved. Bells rang in cities, and people wore black armbands in mourning. Leaders across the world recognized the greatness of the man who had lived not for himself, but for his country. Even today, George Washington is remembered not just as the first president, but as the man who set the tone for American leadership: honest, steady, and selfless. And that is the story of George Washington, a boy from Virginia who became a surveyor, a soldier, a farmer, a general, and finally, a president. His life reminds us that leadership is not about power. It is about service. It is about standing firm when others are ready to give up. Now, let us see what you learned. I will ask you 5 questions about the story. See how many you can answer correctly. Pause the video if you need more time. Where was George Washington born? He was born in Virginia. What job did George do when he was a teenager? He worked as a surveyor, measuring land and making maps. What war did George Washington fight in before the American Revolution? He fought in the French and Indian War. What was the name of George Washington's farm? It was called Mount Vernon. How many years did George Washington serve as president? He served for 8 years. Great job! Thank you for joining me in this journey. I hope you enjoyed learning English through this story. If you liked this lesson, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next story. See you next time, here on Mr. Easy Peasy English.